It was 1952 when the first edition of the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, was published by the APA, or American Psychological Association, with the goal of standardizing diagnosis criteria as well as research interpretation for mental health professionals across the United States. It was quickly adopted and is still regarded as the best source for mental health information, used by health insurance and pharmaceutical companies, as well as the American legal system. Included within this list of mental disorders was homosexuality, listed under sociopathic personality disturbances as sexual deviation, alongside transvestism, pedophilia, and fetishism. Despite studies such as the Kinsey Report or findings made by Evelyn Hooker dating back to 1957, homosexuality would remain in the DSM unchanged until its removal in 1973. This is Biltmore, Fryer, and Gittings, and the battle to depathologize homosexuality. So, how did we get here from 1952? Well, picture it's 1969. The Stonewall riots just took place in New York, and LGBT organizations are gaining support all over the nation. The rising homophile movement, as it was dubbed at the time, enabled gay rights groups to meet and establish platforms. It was during this time that the impact of the connection between mental illness and homosexuality was brought to the head of the LGBT liberation agenda, and as groups such as ECHO, or East Coast Homophile Organizations, continued to meet, activists grew restless. These rising tensions finally caused a storm when the second annual Southern California Behavior Modification Conference was announced. The conference was held at the Millennium Biltmore Hotel, a popular spot within the gay community of the time, as its bar was one of few within Los Angeles' The Run, a close cluster of gay-friendly establishments. Hosted by the APA and helmed by the University of Birmingham's M.P. Feldman, the aim of the conference was to discuss the use of aversion therapy, often referred to as electroshock therapy, to treat disorders such as homosexuality. However, during a film showcasing the use of aversion therapy, around 60 members of the Los Angeles chapter of the National Gay Liberation Front, a prominent activist group at the time, burst through the doors of the Biltmore Hotel and took the stage in what became known as the Biltmore Invasion. After a brief verbal struggle, an hour of open communication between the protesters and the professionals took place, allowing for suggestions from gay activists and providing a broader perspective for these professionals to employ going forward. The Biltmore invasion of 1970, along with the many protests it inspired, had changed the perspective on homosexuality, and the dialogue that took place humanized those in the LGBT community in the eyes of many of the mental health professionals present. In the year that followed the conference, more and more professionals within the APA began to entertain new ideas surrounding the treatment of homosexuality. This mentality shift culminated in a panel in the 1972 APA conference across the United States entitled Psychiatry, Friend or Foe to the Homosexual, a dialogue. One of the head organizers of this panel was Barbara Gittings. Often referred to as the mother of the gay rights movement, Gittings had an extensive history in activism even prior to the Stonewall riots. By 1970, she had helped to found the New York chapter of the Daughters of Bilitis, a notable activist group at the time, and served as an editor for their magazine, The Ladder, where she would advocate for lesbian representation within the movement. She organized picket lines at the U.S. Capitol and, alongside Frank Kameny, led the July 4th annual reminder pickets at Independence Hall from 1965 to 69. Despite all the progress she contributed to, she still felt as though there was one significant barrier that needed to be overcome, stating in a 1967 letter, quote, "I keep trying to convince people in the movement that the charge of sickness is perhaps our greatest problem. We can't really progress in other directions until the unsubstantiated assumption of sickness is demolished," end quote. Composed of both homosexuals and psychiatrists, the panel sought to continue open conversations between the two groups in an effort to further the progress that emotional appeals had previously garnered. However, it was Gittings' partner, Kay Lawson, who pointed out a gap in the panel, stating, quote, "This isn't right. Here you have two psychiatrists pitted against two gays, and what you really need is someone who is both," end quote. Panel organizers
in Winchester,
reached out
Kentucky,
to countless psychiatrists,
Fryer graduated from
all
high
of whom
school
were
at
too
just
afraid
15,
to publicly share their
and in
stories.
1962,
They settled for
received
reading
his
letters
medical
detailing
degree
their experiences
from Vanderbilt University
until they came
in
across
Nashville,
Dr. John
Tennessee.
Fryer.
He began his psychiatric residency at the Menninger Foundation in Topeka, Kansas, but later left due to the pressure of concealing his identity as a homosexual man. He then moved to Philadelphia, where he continued his residency at the University of Pennsylvania until he was this time forced to leave due to his homosexuality. He was finally able to complete his residency at Norristown State Hospital in 1967. Fryer continued to struggle in his field despite his efforts to conceal his identity. He would be asked to leave a position at Friends Hospital, sent away with the explanation that, quote, "If you were gay and not flamboyant, we would keep you. If you were flamboyant and not gay, we would keep you. But since you are both gay and flamboyant, we cannot keep you," end quote. He had been immensely successful academically, but this statement carried the message held by most mental health professionals at the time, acknowledging the politics involved in the APA's condemnation of homosexuality, which seemed to outweigh the genuine beliefs of those who practiced. Fryer was finally able to secure a position at Temple University in 1967, becoming an instructor of psychiatry by 1969, but did not secure tenure. Upon being contacted by panel organizers Barbara Gittings and Frank Kameny, Fryer was reluctant to step forward, fearing he would once again be ousted from his position on a medical faculty. It was only after Gittings convinced him that he would be able to conceal his identity that Fryer agreed to take the stage. Donning, ironically, what some claim to have been a modified Richard Nixon mask, Fryer began his speech, "I am a homosexual. I am a psychiatrist." His aim was to appeal not only to the compassion of the directors and psychiatrists present, but also to the reported 100 closeted gay psychiatrists he knew were present at the convention. It should be noted that despite the progress gained by those involved in these protests, most were racist, and the progress was not obtained with anyone but white members of the LGBT movement in mind. In his speech, Fryer chose to include the N-word and compare those who concealed their identity to the, quote, "black man with light skin who chooses to live as a white man," choosing to ignore the vast discrepancy between these experiences for his own gain. He would go on to do this many times in his speech. Everyone involved in this program and working with Fryer was complicit in this, and this is generally indicative of the culture behind those in the movements. When researching these people and incidents, there is no mention of their racism. It is only upon viewing images of Fryer's handwritten speech that his words are visible. It is necessary to avoid glorification of these activists because at their core they were racist before activists. Throughout his speech, Fryer refers to the, quote, "gay PA," as the closeted psychiatrists had come to refer to themselves. He references the need to appear more than sane as homosexual psychiatrists, stating that, quote, "just as a black man must be a Superman, so must we in order to face those among our colleagues who know we are gay," again using black oppression as a tool to appeal to his white colleagues, similarly to the women's suffrage movement, which was built on a foundation of black oppression, illustrating a trend within white activism. His speech would likely not have been as effective had he not appealed to those around him as a white man. Fryer went on to appeal to the gay PA once again, urging those within it to assist those homosexuals that came to them for treatment and, quote, "develop creative ways to let the patients know that they're all right." He acknowledged the fear holding many psychiatrists back, using his own experience with career disruption to name their common fears of loss of business or opportunities for advancement within their field, but offered this alternative motivation that reignited the courage within those professionals who had, for years, sacrificed their identities for their jobs, and at the same time, humanized homosexuals in the eyes of those present. We are taking an even bigger risk in not living fully our humanity, with all of the lessons it has to teach all the other humans around us. This is the greatest loss, our honest humanity, and that loss leads all those others around us to lose that little bit of humanity as well. We must use our skills and wisdom to help them and us grow to be more comfortable with that little piece of humanity called homosexuality. In response, Dr. Judd Marmer, then vice president of the APA, stated, quote, "I must concede that psychiatry is prejudiced as has been charged, and in doing so informally solidified the idea that there is no scientific precedence for the pathologization of homosexuality." The years of work put in by activist groups across the nation culminated in a 1973 vote by the trustees of the APA to eliminate homosexuality as a mental disorder, a decision that was upheld the following years by the majority of the voting members of the APA. This was not, however, a complete win, as homosexuality was effectively relabeled and replaced by, quote, "sexual orientation disturbance," a condition defined as, quote, "individuals whose sexual interests are directed primarily towards people of the same sex and who are either disturbed by, in conflict with, or wish to change their sexual orientation." While references to homosexuality in the DSM were not entirely eliminated, this change did allow for those who identified as homosexual to possibly be seen as mentally well, whereas before homosexuals were inherently ill. The battle to depathologize homosexuality did not end in a cinematic shift of American ideals. It was, at its core, an incremental step towards progress within an oppressive system helmed by and impacting privileged members of the LGBTQ+ community. Through this series of protests and dialogues, however, one may gain insight into the small journey towards larger changes. When researching this topic, there was not a lot of news coverage. Instead, mostly mentions in medical papers, suggesting that this may not have been widely known or popular topic. When observing this lack of individual awareness, one gains the ability to apply an investigative lens to the small-scale protests happening around them in order to gauge the compromises, parties impacted, and overall role in larger chains of events. With this added perspective, social change can be achieved at an extremely accelerated rate.